Hi there, and welcome to session 2 in this 4-part series, this mindfulness series brought to you by Prepped in partnership with us at the WiseMind Company. My name is Ashley Frankel, and I'm one of the co-founders at the WiseMind Company. We're a global consulting and development firm that focuses on building well work cultures where individuals and businesses flourish. And we really focus on the cultivation of soft skills, or the human skills, as a fundamental component of developing strengthened leadership and sustainable well-being. Our work at the WiseMind Company is founded in the sciences of positive psychology, the research and science of mindfulness and neuroscience as well. But it's also informed by our personal journey. So Liz, my co-founder, is here with us as well today. She's going to be managing the chat box and helping us to answer your questions at the end of our session. But Liz and I each had a decade long of experience in the corporate world, Liz in banking and myself in law. And that experience really informs our work as well. In fact, it was my experience with quite debilitating anxiety, both social and generalized anxiety, while I was practicing law, that really was the catalyst for everything that the WiseMind Company is today. So this session today on unwinding your anxious mind is really close to my heart. And I'm looking forward to diving into these practices with you today. I also think it's important to add, we are in a really heightened state right now with everything that's going on in the world around us, within us as well, even in our own lives directly. And I just wanted to add that if you're feeling like your anxiety is at a level that is debilitating, where it's making everyday activities difficult or impossible, then I do suggest these practices are very, very helpful. But it is also important in those circumstances to reach out to either your general physician, your doctor, or to a trusted therapist as well, because they can provide some really great additional support and resources where necessary. So let's just take a quick look at where we're going to go today, a little roadmap before we get into it. We're going to start off by exploring what anxiety is and how anxiety manifests itself. Throughout this session, as we move through this, there are going to be opportunities for you to reflect, and we'll pose them as questions. The reason that we do this is because one of the most important parts of learning to work with our anxiety in a way that's effective is actually cultivating self-awareness. Okay, but in the practice of mindfulness, we just want to invite you, when you are reflecting throughout this session, to invite in these qualities of mindfulness like compassion and curiosity and kindness to yourself, non-judgment. So the purpose of reflecting is not to criticize ourselves or even want to try to change anything, but it's really to cultivate this greater awareness of our own anxiety and our relationship to it as we go. And then we're going to get into 4 evidence-based practices to help unwind your anxious mind. We're also going to have an opportunity to pull it all together in a formal mindfulness meditation at the end of the session. So we hope you'll be able to stick around until the end. And I want to assure you that at that point, we are going to take some time to answer some questions. We're actually going to stick around today until 12:45, and so we can have a bit of a longer period of time to answer those questions. I'm just wondering how many of you can relate to this. So if you can't see this, it says, what is that? And there's this jumble of color mixed together. And this little bunny says, oh, just my mind. You know, I think this is me on any given day, and then even more so these days. So just a quick poll as we get started. How many of you have noticed that your anxiety levels have been heightened over the course of the last few months, and perhaps even more so in the last couple of weeks? So I think we have a poll here. Nope, nothing's popping up. That's okay. I do notice that a lot of people are relating to this. So I want you to know that one of the reasons we ask this is definitely not from a place of judgment, from a place of like this idea of common humanity, that we're not alone in this, right? So many times when we're struggling with things that are uncomfortable, we can feel quite isolated. But clearly this heightened anxiety is something that many of us are dealing with. And for good reason. So Dr. Judson Brewer, who's a leading researcher in the space of anxiety and addiction, actually, as well as mindfulness and how those practices help support us, is that he says that anxiety is what arises when there is fear and uncertainty. Okay, and I think that we can all nod to the fact that we are living in a time of heightened fear and a lot of uncertainty around what's coming next. What's interesting is that the research also tells us that the anxiety and the counterproductive thinking that goes along with it is heightened even more so in 4 specific circumstances. The first is when there's vague and ambiguous information. So that relates to the uncertainty. When something you value is at stake. And I think for a lot of us, we've been feeling, and it may be different for each of us, but whether it's your financial security and stability or your health and well-being, that feeling of something we really value, some of those fundamental basic comforts being at stake. When you're run down, stressed out, and tired, and also when you're doing something for the first time. You know, and for many of us, all 4 of these have been true and continue to be true right now. So I think one of the really powerful questions is to ask yourself, this is a great reflection, if your anxiety is heightened right now, can you identify what triggers you? What is it that tends to trigger that heightened level of anxiety? I want to say that anxiety is very normal, okay? So before we move on, anxiety is normal, and not only is it normal, but it actually is a really important function for us. It keeps us safe. And also, in certain circumstances, in the right doses, anxiety can even help motivate us and help us achieve some of the things that we're really looking to achieve. The challenge becomes when anxiety levels get too high or they're sustained for too long, and they can become detrimental and get in the way of our optimal functioning. So really what we're looking at is learning, how do we relate to our anxiety in a way that's helpful to us and not hurtful? How do we relate in a way that's helpful and not hurtful? So before we go any further, it is important for us, I said that creating awareness around how anxiety shows up for us is a really important step in terms of how we navigate it. So I just wanted to give you a moment to consider and share in the chat box, how does anxiety show up for you? When you're feeling anxious, what does that look like? So maybe just throwing down. So I see irritability, yes, sleepless nights, nausea, nervous, so that feeling of nervousness, tired, difficulty breathing, frustration, exhaustion, hot and sweaty, pacing, stressed emotions, a lot of insomnia, and racing thoughts, starting to feel small. So what we're seeing here from this stream of shares, and thank you for sharing, is that anxiety tends to manifest, this is simplified, but it's sufficient for our purposes, in 2 main ways. Uncomfortable physical sensations, so things like butterflies and tension and sweaty palms, and then also as unhelpful thoughts. So someone talked about that spinning thoughts, focusing on the future. This anxious mind tends to be very future focused because we have fear and uncertainty. So the brain's desperately trying to figure out what's coming next and how do I protect us from this real or perceived threat. It tends to be negative in nature, that thinking. And it also tends to be catastrophizing. And this is a word that really, as soon as I heard it in the context of anxiety, I was relating to it. Basically what this is that our thoughts about the future are very much about the worst case scenario. We do this really amazing job when we're anxious of spinning ourselves into the worst case scenario. Here's what's important about this. It's not the thoughts themselves that cause the distress, okay? It's the fact that we buy into those thoughts, which most of the time are actually not true, okay? So just one basic foundational thought here for you, or principle, is that our thoughts are not facts. So one of the things we really want to be able to do is start to untangle ourselves from those thoughts and to create some space between us and the thoughts. So how do we unwind our anxious mind? Well, first, I want to look at what we typically do, okay? So you might want to ask yourself, when anxiety arises for you, what's your response? Are you fighting it and resisting it? Do you try to numb it out? Do you tend to run away from it? You know, I know that's been true for me for the most part. So we have a poll come up. I'm just curious about if you have awareness of how you deal with it, what does that look like? Accepting and allowing the anxiety. So it looks like we're running here at about 50%, which is interesting. So there's some people who are moving into that space of acceptance and allowance, and there's some resisting. So what people often do is, or at least their first line of defense, if you will, with anxiety, is that we get tangled up in it. So the challenge with this is, what we know from the research is that, as this quote asserts, whatever you fight, you strengthen. And what you resist persists. And because anxiety is so uncomfortable, we do tend to push it away or get in the ring with our anxious thoughts and get all tangled up in them. We ultimately start believing the stories that we're spinning about the future and act from that place. What we want to learn to do, and this is where mindfulness is very powerful, is to actually start to learn how to cultivate what it looks like about half of you are already doing, this acceptance and allowance of the anxiety, which is actually what helps to take its power away. Mindfulness practice is a superpower in this way because it begins to help us shift the relationship. It allows us to come out of the future and into the present. It allows us over time to learn how to become more comfortable being uncomfortable. And it helps us create space between our thoughts and our actions so that we can take action from a place that's wise instead of that anxious mind, right? So how do we get our wise mind back online? How do we do this? The good news is there are simple practices. So I'm going to share with you 4 mindfulness practices that we refer to as on-the-go practices. These are practices you can do. You don't have to sit in a formal meditation. You can just access them as part of your daily life. And then afterwards, we're actually going to pull them all together into a formal meditation. The first practice is coming to your senses. So engaging in your senses is a fast and really simple way to bring yourself into the present moment and calm your mind. Anxiety, given its very nature of being future focused, loses its power when you come into the present moment. And so I challenge you to try being anxious and fully engaged with your senses at the same time, because it's virtually impossible. So this simplest practice is just what we call a 3x3 practice. Anytime you notice that those triggers for you of anxiety are starting to be present, or you're getting caught up in those anxious thoughts, the butterflies are flying, take a moment and pause, and you want to tap into your immediate environment. So you might notice 3 things you can see and 3 things you can hear. You can always expand this to all your senses, but you often don't even need to. By the time you're done naming, silently to yourself or aloud, 3 things you can see and 3 things you can hear, that's often enough to create that space and take you out of that spin cycle of the negative thought patterns. The second practice, we can't talk about mindfulness without talking about breathing, is what we call our vagus breathing. And it's otherwise can be just referred to as deep breathing. I like referring it to as vagus breathing because I want to talk to you for a minute about the vagus nerve. I find it quite fascinating, actually, and it really helps to explain why this practice is so powerful. So the vagus nerve, which is also referred to as the nerve of emotion, is the largest cranial nerve that relays messages. So it runs from the base of your brain all the way down deep into your abdomen. And what it does is it relays messages from the brain to the respiratory, digestive, and nervous systems in your body. So this neural pathway actually facilitates your ability to find calm. How does it work? Well, it activates what's called the relaxation response in your body, or your parasympathetic nervous system, which in turn then decreases the anxiety and stress and inflammation caused from stress that's in your body. Here's the cool part. There are some really simple things you can do to stimulate your vagus nerve, including laughter, by the way, does a great job at massaging it. But the one we're going to do today is slow breathing. Okay, and we're going to practice it now, actually, just so you can see how quick and effective it is. So as adults, we take an average of 10 to 14 breaths a minute. So all we want to do is really cut that in half. We want to end up slowing down to about 7 breaths a minute. If you count 5 seconds on an inhale and 5 on an exhale, that's going to get you there. And if you can stretch it a little bit more to 6, even better. So why don't we give it a try and just see how shockingly effective it can be. Okay, so you can keep your eyes open for this practice. This is actually one you can do while you're walking or about to enter an interview or even in the middle of a challenging conversation. Today, I want to give you the opportunity to either do it eyes open, or if you want to kind of make it a bit of a deeper practice, close down your eyes. And just allow your attention to land on your body breathing, whatever that means for you and wherever that is. And we're going to just slow the rhythm of breath. So inhaling for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then exhaling 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Again, inhaling 2 more times. 4, 3, 2, 1. And then exhale 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Taking one last cycle of breath at your own count, and just making sure the breath is going deep into the belly. So noticing the belly rising deep in your abdomen, and then exhaling. And allow the breath to return to its natural rhythm. And I just want to invite you to share what that experience of vagus breathing or deep belly breathing was like for you in the chat. In part because one of the most impactful parts of any mindfulness practice is the moment we take after to just pause and notice, how did that feel? So just want to invite you to share. And maybe you can even read what some of your fellow participants are sharing, and maybe a word or two will resonate with you. But we're seeing things like calming and relaxed and grounded. And honestly, all these years later, sharing these practices, it moves me so deeply when we can start to see how quickly we can shift ourselves from a place of anxiety and stuckness to a place where we can access our greatest thinking and a sense of calm and security. My belly got bigger. Yes, the belly gets bigger when we breathe deeply. And please keep sharing. I'm going to keep moving on so we can meet our timing here, but I love that it makes me feel so calm and secure, right? Yes, that feeling of safety and security. And so often a feeling of insecurity, you know, is what actually, in that fear that's at the heart of anxiety. So if we can create this sense of security within ourselves, we can really move ourselves or give ourselves a greater ability to be with anxiety. The next practice I want to share is called Name It to Tame It. This is a phrase coined by Dr. Dan Siegel. I love Dan Siegel. If you are interested in diving deeper into mindfulness, he is absolutely brilliant. He's a professor of clinical psychiatry at UCLA Medical School. He's also the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. And naming it to tame it is really this practice of labeling or noting the emotions and the thoughts that we're having. And what the research tells us is that mental noting can reduce intensity of those emotions and the thoughts by up to 50%. That is really significant. So the practice, again, is really simple. And what you're going to do is you're going to just, when you feel those emotions that so many of you identified, that you connect to your anxiety, or you notice yourself caught in thinking that's catastrophic, worst case scenario, or you're ruminating on one thought or one fear, something about the future, You just come to this place and start labeling it. And so here's how the practice goes, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why it's so effective. A key thing here is that we want to do the naming and noting in a voice that is calm and compassionate. Okay, so we want to engage in a calming. We're so critical of ourselves, and so often when we find ourselves in these states of anxiety, we're very critical. We beat ourselves up, right? This is part of the resistance. So what we want to do is actually flip that, and one way to do that is by the tone in which you speak to yourself. So in a calm and compassionate voice, you might say, "This is a moment of sadness. This is a feeling of anxiety. This is fear. This is anger." Okay, with your thoughts, you might label the nature of your thought. So this is worry. This is planning. This is rumination. Or this thought is fear-based. What's really moving about this is that when we label the emotion and the thought this way, we create space between us and the emotion and the thought. We disentangle ourselves. And as soon as we do that, we realize we are not our anxiety. We are separate from our anxiety. And in that moment, we disempower it. When we note, we also know from brain imaging scans that when we note or we're labeling, almost instantly, the smart part of the brain, which goes offline when we're really anxious, comes back online. And what that means is when it comes back online, we can access our highest order thinking. We become less reactive, we can respond wisely, and we can think more clearly. The fourth practice is don't believe everything you think, okay? Don't believe everything you think. And this may sound obvious, but actually so often we just take our thoughts as facts and we run with them, okay? So if you think about it, your thoughts are like coordinates on a GPS, okay? So when we plug into those thoughts, they determine where we end up. What we want to do is start to cross-examine our thinking, okay? The lawyer in me loves this one. It's also been really helpful for me personally and quite in all seriousness. It's highly effective for those really sticky thoughts, the ones that you just can't seem to get out of. So the next time you notice yourself stuck in rumination or spinning out, I want you to try to just ask yourself this one question. It's often all you need is one question, but I have more for you here in case that's not enough. And that is, am I sure this is true? Okay. This comes from ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. It's also a core practice in cognitive behavioral therapy. Am I sure this is true? Okay. This is often enough to unhook us from those thoughts. If it's not, you can then ask yourself questions like, what evidence do I have that this is true? And is there an alternative scenario that's also possible? Okay. And then once you've done that, if you'd like to, you can, I see, what does ACT stand for? ACT stands for acceptance and commitment therapy. You can also then reframe your thinking into more effective ways of thinking by asking yourself what's possible right now or what can I control? So often with anxiety, we're focused on all the things we can't control, right? That's that fear and uncertainty leads us to hyper-focus on the future that we don't even know what's going to play out. So by asking yourself, what can I control? You bring yourself back into the present moment and you really start to work with what's right here, right now. What do you have enough information to enable you to actually do, right? And sometimes that's only what's 1 minute in front of you. Sometimes that horizon is 1 day. Other times it's a week, right? So we just want to be compassionate with ourselves and acknowledge that at different times, we might only be able to think about what's right in our immediate future, and that's okay. I mentioned at the beginning that each of these 4 practices are mindfulness to go practices. There's things you can do on the go. But what's really interesting is that you can also wrap them all up together in one of, I would say, the most powerful mindfulness meditation practices there is. And this is called the S.T.O.P practice. And I'm going to guide you in a formal mindfulness meditation practice that is S.T.O.P, that will allow us to practice each one of the practices we talked about in a formal way. S.T.O.P is part of the mindfulness-based stress reduction protocol designed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, one of the founding fathers of mindfulness in the Western world, and really one of the people responsible for getting all the research going behind mindfulness. And we can thank him for that, because I don't think we'd be sharing it in this space if it wasn't for that research. So stop. Whenever you're feeling anxious or stressed, you just remember, stop. Stop and sense into your immediate surroundings. T, take a breath. Observe what's going on within you and around you, and proceed. Proceed from that place of calm and clarity and asking yourself, what's most important right now? What can I control? Or how do I want to feel? And what is something I can do to feel that way? I want to invite us to experience this now, but I also want to let you know that after the meditation, we will be staying on to take questions. So we hope you can stick around. If for any reason you can't past the 30-minute mark, I want you to please, I'm going to leave my email address here. If you have a question or you want some additional support or resources, please email me. And I will absolutely make sure I respond to every question that comes through. Okay? So why don't we begin our formal practice? I want to invite you to, for this practice, close down your eyes. But if for any reason that is triggering, then you can leave them open and take a gaze a few inches in front of your feet. Closing down your eyes or affixing your gaze, I just want to say that if this is your first time meditating, if you can breathe, you can meditate. Okay, and we don't need to try to quiet our minds. That's not the purpose at all. We want to familiarize ourselves with our minds. Okay? The other thing I want to say is there's no right way to do this, and there's no wrong way to do this. Okay? So whatever the experience is for you, it is. So just inviting you to settle in to your seat, maybe noticing the way that your buttocks feels against the chair or the floor or the couch. And just stopping and starting by sensing. So we're actually going to begin by sensing into our feet for this practice. So just bringing your attention to your feet. Okay, oftentimes if you're very charged with anxiety, bringing your attention to a neutral part of the body can help diffuse that anxiety. So noticing the feeling of your feet against the floor, and noticing any other sensations in your feet, maybe tingling or warmth or coolness. And now bringing your attention to your sense of hearing. So just tuning in to any sounds you can hear around you or within you. Maybe noting 3 of them. 3 things you hear. And if your mind wanders off, then you can just gently bring it back to the practice. And now settling in by taking 3 deep belly breaths, just taking them at your own pace, but ensuring the breath makes its way deep into your belly. And now allowing your breath to return to its natural rhythm. I want to just spend a minute observing, just getting familiar, creating awareness of that internal atmosphere. So starting by observing any physical sensations in the body and then noting them silently to yourself. So start with your attention at the top of your head and just let it fall down to your toes. And as you go, pausing when you notice a sensation, and just note what that sensation is without judgment, without trying to change it. You may note itching, tension, tightness. tingling. And then bringing your attention after your next exhale to your thoughts. Spending a breath cycle or two here, noticing the quality of your thinking. You may notice if your mind is cloudy or clear, if it's worried or calm. And if you can notice your thoughts, you may label them: worry, thinking, planning. And now just bringing your attention to your emotions. And if it gets to be too much, those emotions at any moment, just landing on your breath. And just asking yourself, what emotions are present right now? Again, resisting the urge to judge yourself or to try to change them. So just noting, this is sadness. This is fear. This is boredom. And then taking one deep breath as we move into coming back out of our practice and back into this space together, proceeding. And as you proceed, perhaps asking yourself, what is one thing I'm taking away with me today? What is one thing I've learned in this session? A practice, a tool, an awareness that you had that you're taking with you. And as you come out of this formal meditation, just as an opportunity to deepen that reflection, inviting you to share in the chat box what that one practice is. And just being gentle with yourself as you come back from the meditation. Stretching, perhaps. I often feel like a yawn coming on when I'm done meditating, and so allowing that to be what it is. And so just acknowledging how that feels. And then sharing with us, as you reflect on this session, what is one learning you are taking away today? The 3x3, I see. Yes. Oh, it seems like someone noticed they were hungry. Okay. Noticing that we're at 33 minutes, I want to acknowledge that if anyone needs to hop off now, thank you for being here. We hope that you found this helpful. And as I said before, we are always available to answer your questions. But I also do want to stick around and start to answer some now. So I'm going to turn it over to Liz. And find it fascinating, as always, that we almost see all the practices coming up. So see, something different works for everyone because our anxiety is different, right? And what resonates for us is different. So I love seeing that. Thank you all for sharing. So Liz, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. One of them is, I find that I go between accepting and labeling my anxiety to then having anxious thoughts again, even though I know it's irrational. Are there any approaches to fixing this that you know of?
What a great question. I want to acknowledge that that's totally normal. I mentioned in the presentation that some of those thoughts can be very sticky. That's part of what makes anxiety so disruptive. And so to that, I would say the fact that you have that awareness is a really great starting point. And I just want to really focus on that word fix, because I think if we can really, fix is really full of judgment. And I think that just if we can take the practice, just keep engaging in the practice, because there's nothing to fix, really. There's nothing wrong. It's just about continuing that loop, I think, of being able to, it's almost like learning to continue to come back to that and to accept almost that that is part of the cycle. So for a really long time, I found myself working really hard, even engaging in mindfulness as a way to try to get rid of my anxiety, to stop those thoughts, those pesky thoughts. I was hoping that at some point that cycle would just go away. But I want to say to you that it's been a lot of years, like well into a decade, that I've been practicing mindfulness religiously. And I live with anxiety every single day. But what's interesting is that my relationship to it has changed. So instead of focusing so much on getting rid of the anxiety or those loopy thoughts, what I've found very helpful is to focus on how I relate to them instead. So now they can be there. I like to say they're there, but instead of being in the driver's seat where they determine where I end up, they're in the passenger seat. And sometimes they're a really annoying backseat driver, but at the end of the day, I still get to decide where I go and how I show up. So I hope that that's helpful.
Also have another one that is, doesn't anxiety have to do with our expectations? If we have high unrealistic expectations, that can mess us up. So would you speak to that for a minute?
Isn't that interesting? You know, I think that I would, in a way, this might be an annoying answer actually, because I'm about to put the question back to the really wise and brave individual who asked it, which is that's part of the awareness, is if for you, you notice. Do you notice, is what I would say, that when you notice your anxiety, does it tend to be connected to these future-focused expectations that you have of yourself? And then really getting, you know, through mindfulness meditation, just creating even more and more awareness around, you know, almost peeling those layers, like what's underneath that and what's underneath that. So if the expectations tend to make you anxious, what is it about those expectations? And you oftentimes, when you drill down, what you're going to find is at the heart of it is fear. So that's going to be different for each of us. But for often, you know, I am a recovering perfectionist, so I'm going to use myself again and be professionally vulnerable here. The expectations were closely related to my anxiety because underneath that was a fear of failure or a fear of not being good enough. So fear plus the uncertainty, back to Judson Brewer, definitely can be correlated with the rise in anxiety. Yeah.
Themed in a similar way, but how do we handle anxiety when either we're going into something that is exciting or nerve-wracking, or an interview process, for example, or even something where we know we may get judgment back from other people?
Mm-hmm.
Some great questions.
What a great question. So how do we practically use this is what I'm hearing. Is that what you're hearing, Liz, in that question? This is what I love about these what's that?
I said, absolutely. I think that in the moment before we're about to do something, it's such a neat practical step.
Absolutely. So we could do a whole session on how to prepare ourselves to optimize the interview. And that would actually be a lot of fun. And I think there's so much we can do. But just leaning on these practices from today. I think number one is if you start to cultivate a regular mindfulness meditation practice, that can build the muscles over time that help you not get triggered as much. Okay, so that's sort of like a long-term plan. It's like building your mental fitness. In the moment, though, when you're heading into an interview, for example, understand that's only one example of things that can make us anxious or excited. Sometimes hard to tell the difference, isn't it? Those butterflies. And actually a neat reframe is when you feel the butterflies, if you start labeling it as excitement instead of anxiety, it can actually start to really shift things in your mind. But that aside, I think if you lean on any one of these practices, you're going to actually be able to, in real time, shift from a stress response to a relaxation response so that your highest order thinking, that smart part, comes back online. So I'd play with them. I mean, I don't want to say which one to use because some are more effective than others for people, but you could ground yourself in your senses, even when you're in the interview room, if it's in person or if it's still virtual, right before it starts. That's helpful. You can take the deep belly breaths, right? So oftentimes before I head into a meeting or if I'm heading into a conversation that's going to be challenging, because I don't like confrontation. I find that I just take a pause before I head into it. And we often refer to it as a sacred pause because so often all you need to do is pause. And then your breathing deepens on its own almost. And your body starts to take you back into that place of relaxation. So I hope that's helpful. Follow up with me with another question if you still need more clarification. Is there another one, Liz, that we can?
Lots.
Oh, do we?
We have many. So one of them is, how do you perfect meditation?
Thank you for this question. This is a question I get asked all the time. And the first thing I want to say is that there is no way to perfect meditation, which is actually can be stressful at first if we're used to sort of having these external guideposts, which many of us are, right? Even if it's in our work, like here's how you get a 4, or here's how you get your full bonus is by achieving this, 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 and this. Mindfulness is an opportunity to actually let go of all of that. And so there is no right or wrong way to meditate. The only thing you need to do is show up and practice. So I like to say that practice makes progress, or practice makes presence, and leave out the idea of practice and perfection altogether. Yeah. Actually, my son once told me that I must be so old because, Mom, practice makes presence is the old way. Now it's practice makes perfect. He thought that it was quite cute. He was like 6 at the time. But I just want us to just start off by knowing that there is no way to perfect it, that there's no right or wrong way. And in fact, at first, that itself can be anxiety inducing, I'm sorry, for some people. However, over time, we can start to see that there's so much freedom in that. So all you need to do is practice, and that's the value. The value is in coming to the practice.
Around how do we help other people if we can see that they may be experiencing anxiety but are blocking the feelings, or how do we help ourselves if others don't understand the anxiety who are close to us?
Yeah, that's a very brave question. That can be really hard. Anxiety, I have described it before as being deafening to the person experiencing it, but silencing many times otherwise. And what I mean by that is anxiety often causes us to not speak up. You know, it almost like takes our voice, or we don't show up sometimes, right? And so it's hard for people to see the anxiety on the outside. And other times it shows up as things that aren't, that look like things that are so different than anxiety. You know, for me, when I was practicing law and really struggling, the anxiety looked like me not being a team player, which was something I never knew myself to be, or being snippy and short. You know, I started to get defensive. And so it can be really hard. That adds that layer where people might think maybe you're just not performing well, but actually what's underneath it is the anxiety. So I just want to acknowledge that. I think that the first part of the question, how you help other people, is, you know, until they're ready, we have to be very sensitive around that. We have to be really sensitive. I think bringing mindfulness qualities to your relationships is a great place to start. We want to start by making sure people in our lives feel safe and that they trust us. So when they're ready, they can come to us. But when I try to tell my kids to take a deep breath when they're having a tantrum, they're not very receptive, okay? So like giving the advice to people when they're not asking doesn't always go over so well. But the best thing we can do as we practice mindfulness is bring those qualities of non-judgment and presence and compassion. And even our deep breathing, we can help people co-regulate, right? It's called mirror neurons. So when we're calming ourselves, the people around us can actually feel it, and their brains start to actually calm down, which is quite remarkable. So I would say practice presence and compassion in your relationships and deep listening. And then I would also recommend that you remember mirror neurons, that if you can calm yourself, you can help someone else co-regulate without saying a word. So unless there's one that you got right on the tip of your tongue, Liz, I was thinking we might wrap up here.
Well, there are so many great questions, and I would encourage everyone to reach out to the email address that's on the screen. I'll leave you with one last one that might be helpful to many people at the moment, and that is just, how do we prevent past events and ruminating in our thoughts that cause anxiety so that they don't come into the future with that same anxiety?
Interesting. I would go back to that practice of naming it to tame it. I would, so much of this is really about awareness. We can't change what we're not aware of. So if you become aware of the rumination, oftentimes that alone is enough for you to choose wisely. You can choose to not act on that. You can have the ruminating thought, but you can choose to act differently. And I think that it's just continuing to come back to that practice, acknowledging the rumination, acknowledging the fear, bringing acceptance and compassion and saying, and I feel this way, and I can choose differently in terms of how I act. So thank you. I really, Megan specifically is asking if we could answer her question. Megan, we'll try to find it, and I'm just going to wrap up, but I will look for your question. And maybe you can stay on for a second. Liz, you could look for it. What I want to say is, please send any questions that we didn't get to my email address, and we don't send spam, we don't have a newsletter we follow up with. We will just directly respond to your question for you. We will also provide the team at Prepped with a handout, and this session has been recorded, I believe, so perhaps you'll be able to access it on an internal system, and we'll provide a handout with additional resources as well as a summary of the practices that we've shared today. And thank you. Thank you for being here and showing up so vulnerably. It's been really a healing session for me too, so thank you for being here. Liz, any luck with Megan's question?
Yeah, so her question is, how do we handle anxiety, stress when we know the recruiter was unfair time and time again? Do we fight it or ignore it?
Interesting. You neither fight it nor ignore it. I have some clarifications to ask you around that, so I would love you to reach out to me. If this is something that you've actually are experiencing right now, we could even have a little chat about it. I don't want to make assumptions, but if you mean by fight it like within yourself, what I would say is I would resist the urge, to fight it, and I would resist the urge to ignore it, because what we resist persists. I would want to encourage you to give yourself space, even through journaling, for example, to fully express the feelings that you're feeling around the recruiter. And your own feelings are so valid. So here's what we say in mindfulness. There's this beautiful parable about the two arrows, and I'm going to leave you with this. The first arrow is what causes us pain. So in this case, it would be the unfairness of this recruiter. And that is something we can't avoid. And in fact, we want to learn to be able to be with those uncomfortable feelings, the anger, the sadness, the frustration, the feelings of injustice. Then what we're talking about is the second arrow. The second arrow is the suffering we cause ourselves by the stories we tell ourselves about that first arrow. That's the piece that then we want to learn how to disentangle ourselves from. So I want to ensure that you're actually giving yourself full permission to sit with the feelings around that first arrow and really create acceptance of whatever feelings you're feeling. And then you can start to work with, if you find yourself in rumination or you're finding yourself with unhelpful thoughts, then can we practice learning to detach from them? So I hope that that is helpful. I am absolutely happy to dive into that deeper with you in an email, in a private email thread. Yeah. So once again, thank you all for being here. It's now 50 minutes, so we've taken a lot longer of your time, but those questions were rich, and I want to thank our hosts at Prepped for sticking around here and letting us be here for longer. I want to wish you well as you head into your day and as you move forward into these challenging weeks ahead. I hope that you can lean on this S.T.O.P practice. Thank you.